I'm Emily Collins, 35, and I earned my commission the hard way. Scholarship, nights at the register, and years of work that turned a kid from the wrong side of modest into an intelligence officer. For years, I kept the family together. Loans, rides, excuses. I was the one who showed up when Danny didn't. But then he texted me 3 words that changed everything. Sold your typewriter. We needed cash. I answered, okay. 20 minutes later, the Pentagon called. That typewriter was a Cold War encryption device worth millions, and suddenly my loyalty to family collided with my duty. Have you ever been humiliated or betrayed by someone you always protected? Tell me in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, drop where you're tuning in from, hit like if you've had to stand up for yourself, and subscribe for more true stories about setting boundaries. What happened next might surprise you. Growing up, Danny and I were inseparable in the way siblings can be when the world feels too big and your parents work too much. I was older by 3 years, which meant I became his shield without asking for the job. When he forgot his homework, I'd slip him mine during lunch. When he came home with a black eye from picking fights he couldn't finish, I'd tell Mom he fell off his bike. Our house sat on the wrong side of modest, where the kitchen table wobbled and Dad's work boots by the door told you more about our finances than any bank statement. Mom cleaned offices downtown, leaving before sunrise and returning after we'd already heated up whatever was left in the freezer. Dad drove delivery trucks, gone for days at a time, coming back with stories about highways and truck stops that made Danny's eyes light up with dreams of escape. I learned early that responsibility fell to whoever was willing to catch it. While Danny spent afternoons exploring abandoned lots and sneaking into movie theaters, I worked the register at Murphy's corner store, counting change and sweeping floors for enough money to keep our lights on. The pattern established itself without ceremony. I held things together. He tested how far they could bend. "You worry too much," Danny would say when I reminded him about chores or curfew. He had this way of shrugging off consequences like they were suggestions rather than inevitabilities. Teachers called him charming. I called him exhausting. But when he'd flash that grin and ask for help with something, I'd find myself saying yes before I knew why. High school crystallized our differences. I joined ROTC, drawn to the clear expectations and earned respect. Danny joined nothing official, but somehow became the center of every group that formed around rule-breaking and shortcuts. While I studied for college entrance exams, he perfected the art of talking his way out of detention. While I worked weekend shifts to save for textbooks, he borrowed $20 here and $40 there, always promising to pay it back next week. Next week became a family joke that wasn't funny. The day I got my acceptance letter to the military academy, I found Danny smoking behind the garage. I showed him the thick envelope, explained what it meant. He took a long drag and said, "So you're really gonna let them tell you how to think for 4 years? It's not like that." "Sure it is." He dropped the cigarette and ground it under his heel. "But hey, somebody's gotta follow the rules, right?" I wanted to explain that it wasn't about following rules. It was about belonging to something larger than myself, about earning the right to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. But Danny had already walked away, and I'd learned that some conversations couldn't be forced. Our grandfather died the spring before I left for the academy. Granddad Joe had been a quiet man who kept his war stories locked away except for occasional fragments that escaped during holiday dinners. He'd served in Europe, then stayed in the military through the Korean conflict and into the early days of Vietnam before retiring to a small house filled with books and the smell of pipe tobacco. The funeral was simple, the way he would have wanted. Afterward, while relatives sorted through his belongings, I found myself drawn to his study. Danny was in the living room, loud-talking with cousins about baseball scores and weekend plans, but something about Granddad's desk called to me. The room felt sacred, unchanged from when I was small enough to sit on his lap while he typed letters on the old machine that occupied the corner of his desk. It wasn't a beautiful typewriter, black metal, heavy and utilitarian, with keys that required real force to strike the paper. But Granddad had used it for everything: letters to old army buddies, complaints to the newspaper editor, stories he never let anyone read. When Mom asked what I wanted as a keepsake, I pointed to it without hesitation. Danny looked at it and laughed. That old thing? It probably doesn't even work. But I knew it worked. More importantly, I knew it mattered. Not just as a memento of Granddad Joe, but as something he'd trusted me to understand. During my last visit before he died, when I'd mentioned my plans for military service, his eyes had brightened with recognition. "That typewriter's been places," he'd said cryptically. "Seen things. Maybe someday you'll understand what I mean." I loaded it carefully into my car, ignoring Danny's eye roll. Mom kissed my cheek and whispered that Granddad would be proud. Dad shook my hand and slipped me $100 bill, pretending it wasn't money he couldn't spare. The academy was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd prepared for. The discipline felt like coming home. The academic rigor pushed me beyond what I thought possible. During my sophomore year, in a seminar on military history and intelligence operations, I learned about encryption devices used during the Cold War. The professor showed slides of machines that looked like typewriters, but served purposes far beyond correspondence. My blood went cold as recognition dawned. That evening, I called home and asked Mom to send me photos of Granddad's typewriter. When they arrived, I compared them to the classified materials in our textbooks. The serial numbers, the specific key configurations, the subtle modifications that separated ordinary office equipment from something far more significant, it all aligned. Granddad Joe's typewriter wasn't just a typewriter. It was a military encryption device, one of perhaps 50 ever manufactured, used for coded communications during some of the most sensitive operations of the 1960s. Its historical value is immense. Its monetary value, to the right collector or wrong buyer, was astronomical. I never told Danny. Military training had taught me the importance of compartmentalizing information, of understanding that knowledge carried responsibility. This wasn't family trivia to share over Christmas dinner. This was a piece of American intelligence history that had somehow found its way into our grandfather's study and now into my protection. When I graduated and received my commission, the typewriter moved with me to every assignment. It sat on my desk in base housing, a reminder of legacy and duty that few people understood. Colleagues would ask about it, and I'd say it belonged to my grandfather, which was true enough. The rest, the classification, the significance, the weight of what I was guarding remained unspoken. Danny visited once during my early years of service. He stayed 3 days and spent most of them complaining about the sterility of military life, the early morning routines, the way everyone seemed to take themselves so seriously. On his last day, he gestured toward the typewriter and said, "Still hanging on to Granddad's junk, I see." "It's not junk. Whatever helps you sleep at night." He was already reaching for his jacket, eager to return to whatever version of freedom he'd constructed for himself. "Just don't let all this uniform stuff make you forget how to live." The door closed behind him, and I sat alone with the typewriter, understanding for the first time that Danny and I weren't just different, we were becoming strangers. But the machine remained, solid and silent, holding secrets that bridged the gap between the grandfather who'd trusted me with its care and the woman I was becoming in his honor. The changes in Danny didn't happen overnight, but they happened consistently. Each phone call home brought updates that painted a picture of someone drifting further from the center of things. He'd started and quit 3 jobs in 2 years, always with stories that made his employers the villains and himself the victim of impossible expectations. He'd moved apartments twice, once because the landlord was unreasonable about late rent, once because the neighbors were uptight about noise complaints. Mom's voice carried worry she tried to hide. "He's just finding himself," she'd say, but finding himself seemed to involve losing everything else. Dad was less diplomatic during our conversations, using words like responsibility and consequences with the weariness of someone who'd had the same argument too many times. The friends Danny surrounded himself with reflected his changing priorities. Where he'd once been impulsive but harmless, his social circle now revolved around people who viewed steady employment as selling out and paying bills as optional. They spoke in the language of quick schemes and easy money, dismissing traditional paths as traps for people too afraid to really live. During one of his rare calls, Danny described his new friends with the enthusiasm he'd once reserved for baseball cards or summer adventures. They were real, he said, unlike the people who worked 9-to-5 jobs and worried about credit scores. They understood that life was meant to be lived, not planned to death. I listened and said little, recognizing the tone of someone trying to convince himself as much as his audience. Military service had taught me to identify rationalization, the mental gymnastics people performed to justify choices they knew weren't serving them well. Danny had become fluent in it. "You sound like you disapprove," he said during one particularly long monologue about the freedom of living without commitments. "I just hope you're happy." "I'm happier than I've ever been." But something in his voice suggested happiness and happiness weren't the same thing, that what he called freedom might feel more like drifting to someone standing on solid ground. The sarcasm crept in gradually. When I mentioned a promotion, Danny would respond with comments about climbing ladders and playing politics. When I described the satisfaction of meaningful work, he'd counter with observations about following orders and surrendering autonomy. Our conversations began to feel like debates he was having with himself, with me as the convenient representative of everything he'd rejected. "Must be nice," he'd say when I mentioned stable housing or regular paychecks, living by someone else's rules. What hurt most was his dismissal of things that mattered to me. When I earned commendations or took on leadership roles, Danny would change the subject or make jokes about gold stars and teachers' pets. When I talked about the honor in serving something larger than myself, he'd respond with eye-rolling references to propaganda and brainwashing. It became clear that my success felt like judgment to him, that every achievement was an implicit criticism of his choices. Rather than finding pride in his sister's accomplishments, he seemed to view them as evidence of his own failures. The distance between us wasn't just geographical anymore, it was philosophical, emotional, fundamental. The typewriter became a particular target of his mockery. During his last visit to my apartment, he gestured toward it with disdain. "Still keeping Granddad's museum pieces? It means something to me. It's a paperweight." He'd picked up a framed photo from my shelf, one of Granddad in his army uniform, and set it down with deliberate carelessness. "All this ancestor worship isn't healthy. You're living in the past." I wanted to explain that preservation wasn't worship, that honoring legacy wasn't the same as living in the past. But Danny had already decided what my motivations meant, and arguing would only confirm his belief that I'd become too rigid to understand freedom. The borrowing continued, though it took new forms. Instead of asking for money directly, Danny would mention problems that money could solve, then wait for me to offer solutions. The car needed repairs he couldn't afford. The security deposit for a new apartment was just out of reach. His friends had opportunities that required small investments he couldn't make. I helped because I still believed in the possibility of change, because blood meant something even when everything else felt strained. But each transaction felt less like helping family and more like enabling choices I couldn't respect. Danny would thank me with enthusiasm, promise swift repayment, then act surprised when I mentioned the debt weeks later. "I thought that was a gift," he'd say, or "I didn't realize you were keeping track," as if my memory of our agreement was somehow petty or unexpected. The pattern exhausted me. His requests, my reluctant assistance, his temporary gratitude, his eventual resentment when I expected follow-through. We were trapped in a cycle that served neither of us well, but breaking it felt like abandoning him completely. So I continued, hoping that eventually he'd find stability, that my support would provide the foundation for better choices. Instead, it seemed to reinforce his belief that consequences were negotiable, that someone would always appear to catch him when he fell. I was learning the difference between helping and enabling, between love and codependency, but the lessons came slowly and at great cost to both of us. The text arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing intelligence reports in my office. 3 words that changed everything: sold your typewriter for $150. We needed cash. I stared at the screen, reading the message repeatedly as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. A second text followed immediately: finally stopped clinging to junk. My hands remained steady as I typed back, "Okay." But inside, everything was collapsing. Danny had no idea what he'd done. To him, he'd sold an old typewriter gathering dust in his sister's apartment, probably feeling proud of his resourcefulness, maybe even believing he was doing me a favor by clearing out meaningless clutter. He'd seen dollar signs where I saw history, opportunity where I saw sacrilege. The encryption device was worth $7.5 million to the right buyer. More importantly, it contained technology that shouldn't exist in civilian hands, components that could be reverse-engineered or sold to hostile parties. What Danny thought was a harmless antique was actually a piece of classified military equipment that I'd been safeguarding without authorization, trusting that its presence in my home would never become an issue. I closed my office door and tried to think through the implications. The device would surface somewhere: auction house, private collection, black market. When it did, its serial numbers would trigger alerts in databases maintained by people whose job was to track exactly these kinds of security breaches. The trail would lead back to me, to questions I couldn't answer without destroying my brother and possibly my career. Military protocol was clear: unauthorized possession of classified materials, regardless of how they were acquired, was a serious offense. The fact that I'd inherited the device wouldn't matter if I'd failed to report its existence. The fact that I'd kept it secure in my home wouldn't matter if someone else now had access to its secrets. But none of that mattered as much as the betrayal itself. Danny had entered my home, identified something he thought might have value, and sold it without asking. He dismissed years of my expressed attachment to Granddad's belongings as sentimentality over junk. He texted about it like he'd thrown away old magazines, casual and slightly mocking, expecting me to thank him for the favor. The phone rang 18 minutes later. "Major Collins?" The voice was crisp, professional, carrying the weight of authority I'd learned to recognize. "This is Colonel Martinez from Pentagon Security. We need to discuss a matter of some urgency regarding equipment that may have been in your possession." "Yes, sir. Are you familiar with a cryptomechanical device? Model CMC-47, serial number 847291? I closed my eyes. "Yes, sir. That device has surfaced in a civilian marketplace. Our records indicate it was assigned to your grandfather, Sergeant First Class Joseph Collins, in 1964. Can you explain how it left secure custody?" The question hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. I could lie, claim ignorance, pretend I'd never seen the device or known its significance. I could protect Danny by taking full responsibility, accepting whatever consequences came from unauthorized possession of classified materials. Or I could tell the truth and let the chips fall where they would. "My brother sold it, sir. He didn't know what it was." The silence stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. Colonel Martinez was making notes, probably running through protocols for breaches involving family members. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted from interrogation to damage control. "We're going to need a full debrief, Major. Today. And we'll need contact information for your brother." "Understood, sir." For what it's worth, Major Collins, your immediate honesty is noted. This could have gone very differently if you'd attempted to cover this up. The line went dead, and I sat alone in my office, staring at Danny's text messages. Finally stopped clinging to junk he'd written, as if my attachment to family history was a character flaw he'd helped me overcome. He had no idea that his quick $150 had just cost both of us everything. I thought about calling him, warning him about what was coming. But military training had taught me that loyalty to family couldn't supersede loyalty to duty, that personal relationships couldn't compromise national security. Danny had made his choice when he sold the device. Now I had to make mine. The Pentagon debrief took 6 hours. Colonel Martinez and 2 other officers walked me through every detail: how I'd acquired the device, when I'd learned its significance, why I'd never reported its existence, what security measures I'd taken to protect it. They were thorough but not hostile, recognizing that my situation was unusual rather than malicious. "Your grandfather should have turned this in when he retired," Colonel Martinez explained. But records from that era were incomplete, and follow-up was inconsistent. The device was probably forgotten by everyone except him. And me. And you. Which creates complications. The implications were clear. I'd been living with classified materials for years without authorization. The fact that I'd kept them secure and never attempted to profit from them worked in my favor, but protocol was protocol. My security clearance would be reviewed. My career trajectory might be altered. My integrity would be questioned by people whose opinion determined my professional future. But all of that felt manageable compared to what Danny was about to face. Military security didn't operate like civilian law enforcement. They wouldn't arrest him dramatically or hold press conferences about the bust. Instead, they'd investigate quietly and thoroughly, following every lead until they understood exactly how a classified encryption device had ended up for sale in downtown Minneapolis. They'd discover that Danny had found the device in my apartment while I was deployed. They'd learn that he'd sold it to a dealer who specialized in vintage electronics and military surplus. They'd trace its movement through at least 2 more hands before it triggered the alerts that brought it to official attention. Danny would be interviewed, probably multiple times. His financial records would be examined. His associates would be questioned. The casual world of easy money and flexible ethics he'd constructed around himself would be exposed to scrutiny from people trained to detect deception and follow evidence wherever it led. Your brother's cooperation will be essential, Colonel Martinez had warned me. If he's truthful and helpful, this can remain a security matter rather than a criminal one. But if he tries to hide anything or protect anyone else involved in the chain of sale, the situation becomes much more serious. I'd nodded and provided Danny's contact information, knowing that his natural instinct would be to minimize, deflect, and blame others for consequences he couldn't have anticipated. He'd probably assume he could charm his way out of trouble the way he'd done in high school, not understanding that military investigators were immune to the kind of casual manipulation that worked on teachers and local cops. That evening, I called home to warn Mom and Dad about what was coming. They listened in stunned silence as I explained the situation, their questions revealing how little they'd understood about both the typewriter's significance and Danny's recent behavior. "He's been staying here again," Mom said quietly. "Lost his apartment last month. He said it was temporary." "There'll probably be people asking questions," I warned. "Federal investigators. They'll be respectful, but they'll be thorough." "What kind of trouble is he in?" Dad's voice carried the weight of too many previous conversations about Danny's choices. "That depends on how honest he is with them." I hung up knowing that I just shattered whatever illusions my parents still maintained about Danny's harmless recklessness. The son they'd been making excuses for was about to face consequences that couldn't be negotiated or charmed away, and their daughter was the one who'd set those consequences in motion. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept thinking about Danny's text message, his casual dismissal of something I'd treasured. "Finally stopped clinging to junk," he'd written, as if helping me clear out meaningless clutter. He'd been so proud of his initiative, so certain he was doing me a favor by converting worthless antiques into useful cash. By morning, I'd made peace with my choice. I'd chosen truth over protection, duty over blood, consequences over enabling. It wasn't a decision made in anger or revenge, but in recognition that some lines couldn't be crossed without response. Danny had betrayed more than just my trust. He'd compromised national security for beer money, and pretending otherwise wouldn't serve anyone. The aftermath unfolded with military efficiency. Danny was contacted within 48 hours. The dealer who'd purchased the device was interviewed and released. The subsequent buyers were identified and cleared. The encryption device itself was recovered and returned to secure storage, its brief adventure in the civilian world documented and filed away. Danny called me after his first interview, his voice shaking with confusion and anger. "What did you tell them?" "The truth." "You threw me under the bus for a typewriter?" I let the silence stretch before responding. "It wasn't a typewriter, Danny. And I didn't throw you anywhere. I just stopped catching you." The conversation devolved from there, Danny cycling through disbelief, rage, and desperate attempts to make me understand that he'd been trying to help, that he'd never meant for any of this to happen, that families were supposed to protect each other from exactly this kind of disaster. But I'd learned something important during those 6 hours at the Pentagon. Consequences weren't disasters. They were corrections. Danny had spent years believing that someone would always appear to shield him from the results of his choices. I'd been that someone, enabling his belief that actions and outcomes were only loosely connected, that charm and family loyalty could substitute for responsibility and respect. "I can't fix this for you," I told him before ending the call. "And I won't try to." For the first time in our relationship, I meant it. Colonel Martinez called me a week later with an update. Danny had been cooperative during his interviews, providing detailed information about how he'd accessed my apartment and sold the device. His story was consistent and appeared truthful. More importantly, the investigation had revealed no evidence of malicious intent or ongoing security risks. "Your brother made a stupid mistake," the colonel said. "But it was stupidity, not treason. That matters in how we handle this." The resolution was anticlimactic in the way that real consequences often are. Danny received a formal warning about handling classified materials and was required to sign agreements acknowledging the seriousness of what had occurred. His financial records were flagged for future monitoring. His associates were noted in security databases. But there were no arrests, no trials, no dramatic confrontations. Just the quiet weight of understanding that actions have results, that some mistakes create permanent records, that the adult world operates according to rules that don't negotiate with good intentions or family connections. My own review took longer, but reached similar conclusions. I received official censure for failing to report the device's existence, along with mandatory retraining on security protocols. My clearance was maintained, my career prospects remained intact, but the incident would follow me through every future background check and promotion review. "You handled this correctly once it began," Colonel Martinez told me during our final meeting. "Your immediate honesty prevented a much more serious situation." That counts for something. What counted for more was the realization that I'd finally stopped protecting Danny from himself. For years, I'd cushioned his falls and cleaned up his messes, believing that family loyalty required unconditional support. But I'd learned the difference between love and enabling, between helping and harm. Danny didn't see it that way. In the weeks that followed, he sent angry texts and left voicemails accusing me of betrayal, of caring more about my precious career than my own brother, of choosing strangers over family when it mattered most. He told relatives that I'd destroyed his life over a grudge, that military life had made me cold and calculating, that he'd never forgive me for putting duty before blood. I listened to the messages and felt sad but not guilty. Danny's version of events cast him as the victim of my rigidity, but the truth was simpler. He'd stolen something valuable from someone who loved him, and when caught, he'd faced consequences he couldn't charm away. My role had been to tell the truth when asked, nothing more or less. The real tragedy wasn't what I'd done to Danny, but what Danny had done to us. He'd taken something irreplaceable, not just the encryption device, but the trust that had survived years of smaller betrayals, and traded it for $150 and the temporary satisfaction of proving that my attachment to junk was pointless sentiment. He'd succeeded in that goal. The typewriter was gone, along with the last physical connection to Granddad Joe and the quiet pride I'd taken in safeguarding family history. But in losing those things, I'd gained something more valuable, the understanding that love without boundaries isn't love at all, but a form of self-destruction that serves no one. Danny spent the next several months discovering what life looked like without his sister's safety net. His friends, already nervous about association with someone under federal investigation, began avoiding him entirely. The quick money schemes and casual rule-breaking that had seemed harmless when consequences were theoretical became untenable when every misstep might trigger additional scrutiny. He lost the job he'd been working sporadically, not because of the investigation directly, but because irregular attendance and casual attitude toward responsibility were luxuries he could no longer afford. The apartment he'd been sharing with friends became unavailable when they decided his presence created complications they didn't need. Mom called with updates that tracked his decline with the precision of a medical chart. He'd moved back home, then fought with Dad about house rules and expectations. He'd applied for legitimate work, but struggled to explain gaps in his employment history and the sudden need for stable income. He'd reached out to old friends who'd moved on to marriages and mortgages, discovering that adult friendships required reciprocity he'd never learned to provide. "He asks about you," Mom would say carefully, testing whether I'd softened enough to resume my role as family protector. "What does he ask?" "Whether you might help him find work. Whether you'd consider giving him a reference." Whether you think this will blow over if he just keeps his head down. I understood what she wasn't saying, that Danny still believed this was a temporary setback, that eventually I'd forgive him and everything would return to the familiar pattern of his problems, becoming my responsibility. He was waiting for me to rescue him from consequences the way I'd always done before, not understanding that the person who'd enabled that pattern no longer existed. He needs to figure this out himself, I'd tell Mom, hearing her disappointment in the silence that followed. But I also heard relief. For years, my parents had watched me sacrifice my own interests to manage Danny's crises, had seen how his emergencies became my obligations. They'd never asked me to play that role, but they'd accepted it because it kept peace in the family and hope alive that Danny might eventually mature into responsibility. Now they were learning what I discovered, that protecting someone from consequences doesn't teach them to make better choices. It just teaches them that choices don't matter because someone else will manage the results. Danny's current struggles weren't punishment for past mistakes, they were education he'd avoided for years. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. There were no breakthrough moments of clarity or tearful reconciliations. Instead, Danny slowly began adapting to a world where his problems remained his own, where charm and family connections couldn't substitute for reliability and effort. He found part-time work at a warehouse, loading trucks and taking inventory. The pay was modest, the hours were early, and the supervisors had no patience for the casual attitude that had cost him previous jobs. But it was steady, and steady began to matter in ways it never had before. He moved into a studio apartment in a part of town he'd previously dismissed as beneath his standards. The neighbors were quiet, the building was old, and the rent consumed most of his income. But it was his, secured through his own efforts rather than family intervention or borrowed money. Most importantly, he stopped asking for help. The requests for loans and references and problem-solving ceased, replaced by brief updates about work schedules and apartment maintenance. When we spoke, rarely and carefully, he sounded different. Not happy necessarily, but solid in ways he'd never been when happiness came easily. "I get it now," he said during one conversation, months after the investigation had closed. "What you were trying to tell me all those years. What was I trying to tell you? That actions have consequences. That you can't just wish problems away. That other people's kindness isn't unlimited." He paused, and I could hear him choosing words carefully. "That family doesn't mean someone else cleans up your messes." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the dynamic between us had been unhealthy for both of us, that my enabling had been as destructive as his taking, that real family meant wanting each other to grow rather than just be comfortable. "I'm proud of you," I told him, meaning it. For what? Finally growing up at 32. For doing the work. For not giving up when things got hard. The conversation was brief, but it marked a shift. Not back to the closeness we'd shared as children, that innocence was gone, but toward something more sustainable. Mutual respect based on who we'd become rather than who we'd once been. Danny was learning to stand on his own. I was learning to let him. Both lessons had been necessary, though neither had come easily. The encryption device that had triggered this transformation was back in Pentagon storage, its brief adventure in the civilian world reduced to a file number and security briefing. But its real legacy lived in the space between Danny and me, in the understanding that sometimes love means stepping back rather than stepping in, that family can survive betrayal if it's followed by truth. That consequences aren't punishments, but opportunities for people to discover who they really are when the safety net disappears. 5 years later, I was stationed at Fort Carson when Danny called to tell me he was getting married. His fiancée was named Maria, worked as a nurse, and had apparently seen something in my brother that was worth building a life around. They'd met at the warehouse where he still worked, though he'd been promoted twice and now supervised the team that had once supervised him. "I'd like you to be there," he said. "If you want to be." It was the first time he'd invited me to anything in years. Not asked for something, not needed something, but wanted me present for something that mattered to him. The distinction felt significant. I'd be honored. The wedding was small, held in the backyard of the house Danny and Maria had bought together. Nothing fancy, folding chairs borrowed from Maria's church, flowers from the grocery store, a cake Maria's mother had made. But everything was theirs, earned through the kind of steady work and careful planning that the old Danny would have mocked as settling for less than you deserve. I watched my brother during the ceremony, noting the ways he'd changed. The restless energy that had once driven him from job to job and scheme to scheme had been replaced by something calmer but more durable. He looked at Maria with the kind of attention he'd never given to anything that required long-term commitment. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried conviction I'd never heard before. During the reception, we found ourselves standing together on the edge of the celebration, watching Maria's nieces chase each other around the folding chairs while elderly relatives shared stories and wedding cake. "Thank you," Danny said quietly. "For what?" "For not bailing me out when the shit hit the fan. For making me figure it out myself." He gestured toward the house, the celebration, the life he'd built. "None of this would exist if you'd kept rescuing me from my mistakes." I thought about the encryption device, about Granddad Joe's typewriter, about the moment when Danny's text had changed everything between us. The betrayal had felt devastating at the time, a violation of trust that seemed unforgivable. But it had also been necessary, the catalyst that forced both of us to examine patterns we'd fallen into without choosing. "I'm sorry it took so long," I said. "I should have stopped enabling you years earlier. You were being a good sister. Or what you thought being a good sister meant." "What does it mean now?" Danny smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached his eyes. "Wanting me to be happy. Actually happy, not just comfortable. And trusting me to figure out how to get there myself." Maria appeared beside us, carrying 2 pieces of cake and wearing the satisfied exhaustion of someone whose important day had gone exactly as planned. She handed Danny a plate and kissed his cheek, and I saw something in the gesture that I'd never seen in his previous relationships: mutual taking care of each other, partnership based on choice rather than need. "Your brother's been telling me stories about you," Maria said. "About growing up, about the military, about that crazy typewriter situation." I glanced at Danny, surprised he'd shared that story. "It's not a secret," he said. "It's just part of how we got here." Maria nodded as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes families have to break before they can heal properly. Like bones. The break hurts, but it grows back stronger if you set it right. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and the folding chairs had been returned to the church, Danny and I sat on his front porch drinking beer and watching the sun set over the neighborhood he'd chosen to call home. It wasn't the life either of us had imagined for him when we were young. No shortcuts to wealth, no dramatic adventures, no escape from the ordinary concerns of ordinary people. But it was solid. It was his. And it was good. "Do you ever think about Granddad?" Danny asked. "About what he'd think of all this?" I considered the question, remembering the quiet man who'd kept his war stories private and his typewriter cleaned and maintained long after it had outlived its official purpose. He'd been a man who understood duty and sacrifice, who'd served his country and then his family without expecting recognition or praise. "I think he'd be proud of us," I said finally. "Both of us. For different reasons, but proud." Even though I sold his typewriter? Even though. Especially though. I finished my beer and set the empty bottle on the porch railing. He gave it to me to keep safe, but keeping it safe wasn't the point. The point was understanding what mattered enough to protect and what mattered enough to let go. Danny nodded, and we sat in comfortable silence as darkness settled around us. Somewhere in the Pentagon, Granddad Joe's encryption device sat in climate-controlled storage, its secrets preserved and its historical significance documented for future generations of intelligence officers to study and learn from. But its real purpose had been fulfilled years earlier, in a moment of betrayal that became transformation. In the space between 2 siblings who'd loved each other imperfectly but ultimately well enough to survive the necessary work of becoming who they were meant to be. The typewriter was gone, but its legacy remained. The understanding that some things are worth protecting, some relationships are worth fighting for. And sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the chance to discover their own strength by removing your support when they need it most. Family can wound, but clarity can heal. Justice arrives not always in drama, but sometimes in quiet resolve, in the courage to tell the truth when it matters, in the wisdom to step back and let consequences teach what kindness cannot. The bonds that survive such testing are different from what came before, stronger, more honest, built on respect rather than obligation. 10 years after the typewriter disappeared from my apartment, I received notification of my promotion to lieutenant colonel. The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday afternoon at Fort Bragg, where I'd been stationed for the past 18 months working in intelligence coordination. Protocol required family notification, but I'd grown comfortable with military celebrations that focused on achievement rather than personal relationships. Danny called 2 days before the ceremony. "Mom told me about the promotion," he said. "Congratulations." "Thank you." "I know it's short notice, but Maria and I were wondering if we could drive down. To be there, I mean. If you'd want us there." The offer surprised me. We'd maintained cordial contact since his wedding, but our relationship remained carefully boundaried. Holiday cards, brief phone calls on birthdays, updates on major life events delivered through Mom rather than directly. Not hostile, but not intimate either. The comfortable distance of siblings who'd learned to respect each other without requiring closeness. You don't have to do that. It's a long drive. We want to, if you're okay with it. He paused, and I heard Maria's voice in the background, encouraging him to say something more. "I've never seen you get promoted. Seems like something I should witness at least once." There was no manipulation in his tone, no suggestion that my agreement would settle old debts or repair old wounds. Just genuine interest in sharing a moment that mattered to me, the kind of gesture that healthy families make for each other without keeping score. "I'd like that," I said, meaning it. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. 40 family members and colleagues gathered in the base chapel while Colonel Harrison read my service record and achievements. When he pinned the silver oak leaves to my uniform, I thought about the 18-year-old who'd left home determined to serve something larger than herself, about the young officer who'd struggled to balance duty and family loyalty, about the woman who'd learned that integrity sometimes required difficult choices. Danny and Maria sat in the third row, dressed in their best clothes and looking slightly overwhelmed by the military formality surrounding them. When the ceremony concluded and people began offering congratulations, I watched Danny approach with the careful respect he'd learned to show institutions he'd once dismissed. "Lieutenant Colonel Collins," he said formally, then broke into a grin. "That sounds pretty impressive. It feels pretty good." Maria hugged me warmly, and I realized that in the years since Danny's wedding, she'd become family in ways that felt natural rather than obligated. She asked intelligent questions about my responsibilities, listened to answers with genuine interest, and made no attempt to navigate the complex history between Danny and me. Over dinner at a restaurant near the base, we talked about their life in Minneapolis, my work in intelligence, the ordinary pleasures and challenges of adulthood. Danny had been promoted again at the warehouse and was considering a move into logistics coordination. Maria was completing her nurse practitioner degree while working full-time, a schedule that would have broken the person Danny used to be, but that he now supported with the kind of steady partnership that made difficult things possible. "We're thinking about kids," Maria mentioned during dessert, glancing at Danny with the shared excitement of people who'd found something worth building on. "Nothing immediate, but soon." I felt an unexpected surge of happiness for them, recognition that they'd created something solid enough to expand. Danny would be a good father, I realized, not because he'd always been responsible, but because he'd learned responsibility the hard way and understood its value. "Uncle Danny," I said, testing the sound of it. "I like that." Later, walking around the base as evening settled, Danny and I found ourselves alone for the first time in years. The conversation felt different from our careful phone calls, more relaxed, less weighted with history. "I'm proud of you," he said as we passed the enlisted quarters where young soldiers were beginning their own military journeys. "Not just the promotion, but all of it. The whole career. The person you've become." "Thank you. I'm proud of you too." "For what?" "Finally becoming a functional adult. For doing the work. For building something real with Maria. For becoming someone worthy of this life you've created." I gestured toward the direction of the restaurant where Maria was probably reading while waiting for us to return. "She's good for you." "She saved my life," Danny said simply. Not dramatically, just by believing I could be better than I was. By not accepting less than my best effort. He looked at me with understanding that felt new. Kind of like what you did, actually. Just with more patience. We reached the base chapel where the promotion ceremony had taken place hours earlier. In the darkness, it looked like any small church in any small town, nothing special or intimidating. But it represented something important to me, recognition earned through years of service, respect granted by people whose judgment mattered, achievement that belonged entirely to my own efforts. I used to think you were too rigid, Danny said. All those rules, all that discipline. It seemed like you were afraid to really live. And now? Now I understand that discipline isn't about fear. It's about building something that lasts. About caring enough about the future to make sacrifices in the present. He kicked a pebble across the sidewalk. I spent years thinking freedom meant doing whatever I wanted whenever I wanted. But that's not freedom. That's just chaos that someone else has to clean up. We turned back toward the restaurant, our conversation settling into the comfortable quiet of people who'd said what needed saying. Danny had driven 6 hours to watch his sister receive recognition for 18 years of military service. I'd invited him to share a moment that defined my professional identity. These weren't gestures motivated by obligation or guilt, but by choice, the conscious decision to include each other in lives that had become meaningful and stable. Do you ever regret it? Danny asked as we reached Maria's car. The way things happened with the typewriter? The investigation, all of it. I considered the question, thinking about the path that had led from that devastating text message to this moment of mutual respect and genuine affection. The betrayal had felt like an ending at the time, the destruction of trust that seemed irreparable. But it had actually been a beginning, the start of an honest relationship based on who we really were rather than who we'd once been to each other. No, I said finally. I regret that it took so long. I regret that we both had to go through so much pain to get here. But I don't regret the result. Even though you lost Granddad's typewriter? I didn't lose it. You sold it. But what mattered about it, the lesson, the legacy, the understanding of what's worth protecting, that's still here. I gestured between us. This is what Granddad wanted me to keep safe. Not the machine, but the family. And not the family as it was, but as it could become if we were brave enough to tell the truth and strong enough to handle the consequences. Danny nodded, and I saw in his expression the man he'd become, someone who understood that actions had results, that relationships required effort, that respect was earned through consistency rather than granted through blood. The restless boy who'd mocked rules and avoided responsibility had grown into someone capable of partnership, commitment, and the kind of daily work that made meaningful lives possible. Maria emerged from the restaurant carrying a small wrapped package. I hope you don't mind, she said, handing it to me. Danny told me the story about your grandfather's typewriter, and I found something I thought you might like. Inside the package was a small silver frame containing a photograph I'd never seen before. Granddad Joe in his army uniform, standing beside a piece of equipment that might have been the encryption device, though the photo was too old and distant to be certain. Beside him stood another soldier, younger and grinning, with Danny's eyes and my stubborn chin. That's your great-uncle Jonathan, Maria explained. Danny's been researching family history since we got married. Turns out your grandfather wasn't the only military hero in the family. I studied the photograph, seeing in it not just individual faces, but the continuation of something larger: service, sacrifice, the quiet pride of people who'd chosen duty over comfort. The typewriter was gone, but the legacy it represented continued in the choices we made, the values we upheld, the families we built and protected. Thank you, I said, meaning more than just gratitude for the gift. That night, in my quarters on base, I placed the photograph on my desk next to my newest commendation and the letter confirming my promotion to lieutenant colonel. Tomorrow, I'd begin new responsibilities, lead new teams, face new challenges that would test everything I'd learned about leadership, integrity, and the balance between personal loyalty and professional duty. But tonight, I felt the satisfaction of someone who'd traveled a difficult path and arrived somewhere worth the journey. The family that had nearly been destroyed by betrayal and enabling had been rebuilt on foundations of truth and mutual respect. The career that had been threatened by association with security breaches had been strengthened by the demonstration of integrity under pressure. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between protection and growth, between loyalty and enablement, between love that restricts and love that empowers. Danny had needed to fall in order to learn how to stand. I'd needed to step back in order to let him discover his own strength. The typewriter had been the catalyst, but the real work had happened in the months and years that followed, as we'd both learned to build lives worthy of the respect we now shared. The bonds that survive testing become stronger than the original connections, forged not in childhood innocence, but in adult understanding of what relationships require to endure. Family can wound, but it can also heal. Justice arrives not always dramatically, but sometimes in quiet moments of recognition, that we'd both become people worthy of each other's admiration, that the love between us had been purified by truth and strengthened by the courage to hold each other accountable. The typewriter was gone, but its real purpose had been fulfilled. Grandad Joe's legacy lived not in preserved machinery, but in the understanding that some things are worth protecting, some truths are worth telling, and some relationships are strong enough to survive the necessary work of becoming authentic. The family we'd built from the ashes of the old one was smaller, more honest, and infinitely more valuable than what we'd lost. In choosing truth over protection, consequences over comfort, I discovered that real love doesn't shield people from their choices, it trusts them to learn from those choices and become stronger because of them. Danny had proven worthy of that trust. In return, he'd given me the gift of being able to respect him not just as a brother, but as a man who'd done the hard work of growing up and building something meaningful from the pieces of his former life. The encryption device sat in Pentagon storage, its secrets secure, and its historical significance preserved. But its greatest achievement wasn't protecting national security, it was teaching two siblings that love without boundaries isn't love at all, that family loyalty means wanting each other to grow rather than just be comfortable, and that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the chance to discover who they really are when the safety net disappears. We'd both fallen, in different ways and for different reasons. But we'd both learned to stand, independently and together, and that made all the difference. 3 years after my promotion ceremony, I received orders for deployment to Germany, a 2-year assignment coordinating intelligence operations across European commands. It was the kind of posting that marked a career trajectory towards senior leadership, the recognition that I'd earned the trust to handle complex, multinational responsibilities. The assignment meant leaving Fort Bragg, selling the house I'd bought near base, packing up a life I'd built over 18 months. It also meant missing Danny and Maria's first child, due 6 months into my deployment. We'd grown closer since the promotion ceremony, but geography would test whether our rebuilt relationship could survive extended separation. "It's an incredible opportunity," Maria said when I called to share the news. "Danny's so proud he can barely contain himself." "Where is he?" "Painting the nursery. Again. 3rd color this month." I heard her laughing in the background, the sound of someone whose life had become unexpectedly joyful. "He wants to talk to you about something." "Military stuff," he says. Danny's voice carried excitement when he came to the phone. "Maria's been researching family history more seriously. We found something you need to know about." "What kind of something?" Grandad Joe wasn't just any soldier. He was part of a classified unit that operated behind enemy lines during the Korean War. The typewriter, the encryption device, it wasn't just assigned to him randomly. He was specifically trained to use it for covert communications. I felt a familiar chill of recognition. Military intelligence had taught me to identify patterns, to understand that coincidences were often anything but coincidental. If Grandad Joe had been part of classified operations, his possession of the encryption device made more sense than I'd realized. "How did you find this out?" Maria's been corresponding with a historian who specializes in Korean War intelligence operations. Apparently, there are declassified documents now, interviews with surviving unit members. Grandad's name appears in several reports. The implications were staggering. For years, I'd assumed that Grandad Joe had somehow acquired the device through bureaucratic oversight, that his possession of it was an accident of incomplete record-keeping. But if he'd been specifically trained to use it, if his unit had relied on it for mission-critical communications, then his decision to keep it after retirement took on different significance. There's more, Danny continued. The historian wants to interview family members. He's writing a book about unsung heroes of the Korean conflict, and he thinks Granddad's story deserves to be told. What kind of interview? Background stuff. Family memories, personal details that humanize the historical record. Nothing classified, just the man behind the mission reports. I thought about the quiet grandfather I'd known, the way he deflected questions about his service, the careful distance he'd maintained from war stories that other veterans seemed eager to share. He'd carried secrets that went beyond family history, professional obligations that had shaped how he understood duty and discretion. I'll think about it, I said, though I already knew my answer would be yes. Granddad Joe deserved recognition for service that had remained hidden for decades. More importantly, his story might help explain why the encryption device had mattered so much to him, why he'd trusted me with its care. The deployment to Germany began with the usual challenges of international assignments, new protocols, different cultural expectations, the complexity of coordinating operations across multiple languages and military traditions. But it also offered opportunities for growth that domestic postings couldn't provide. Within 6 months, I was leading joint exercises involving American, British, and German intelligence units. The work required diplomatic skills as much as technical expertise, the ability to build trust across national boundaries while maintaining operational security. It was exactly the kind of experience that prepared officers for senior leadership roles. During quiet moments between meetings and exercises, I found myself thinking about Granddad Joe's service, about the young soldier who'd operated behind enemy lines with primitive communication equipment and enormous courage. The encryption device I'd safeguarded for years had been more than a family heirloom. It had been a tool of war, used by people who risked everything for intelligence that might save lives or prevent disasters. Danny's son was born on a Tuesday morning in October. Jonathan Joseph, named for the great-uncle Maria had discovered and the grandfather whose legacy we were slowly understanding. The video call from the hospital showed Danny holding a tiny, wrinkled baby with the same stubborn chin that ran through our family, the same alert eyes that had gotten us both into trouble over the years. "He's perfect," Danny said, his voice thick with emotion I'd never heard before. 10 fingers, 10 toes, lungs that work really well. Maria looked exhausted but radiant, cradling the baby with the confidence of someone who'd prepared thoroughly for this responsibility. "We wanted you to be one of the first to meet him, even if it's through a screen." Watching them with their son, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Joy for their happiness, gratitude that Danny had become someone worthy of this trust, sadness that geography prevented me from sharing the moment in person. But also recognition that this was how healthy families functioned, sharing important moments across whatever distance is necessary, maintaining connections that survive separation. "I'll be back for his first birthday, I promised. And Christmas, if I can manage leave." "We're counting on it," Danny said. Uncle duties start immediately, even from 4,000 miles away. The historian, Dr. Robert Chin, contacted me directly 3 weeks later. His email was professional but warm, explaining his research into classified Korean War operations and his specific interest in Granddad Joe's unit. He'd already interviewed 2 other surviving family members and had uncovered details that painted a picture of extraordinary service under impossible conditions. "Your grandfather was part of a 12-man unit that operated behind Chinese lines for 18 months, Dr. Chen explained during our first video call. They provided intelligence that influenced major strategic decisions, but their work remained classified until 2019. Even now, many details can't be discussed publicly." "What can you tell me?" "Enough to understand that your grandfather was a genuine war hero. His unit prevented at least 3 major Chinese offensives by providing early warning of troop movements. The encryption device you mentioned was critical to their success. It allowed them to communicate with headquarters without fear of interception." Learning about Granddad Joe's real service record recontextualized everything I'd thought I understood about his character. The quiet man who'd deflected praise and avoided war stories had been hiding extraordinary courage and sacrifice. His decision to keep the encryption device hadn't been oversight or sentiment. It had been recognition of its significance to operations that had saved American lives. Why didn't he ever talk about it? Men like your grandfather rarely did. They understood that real heroism doesn't require recognition, that some stories are too important to become entertainment. Plus, much of what they did remained classified throughout their lifetimes. Dr. Chen's book, Silent Warriors, Untold Stories of Korean War Intelligence, was published 18 months later. Granddad Joe's chapter, titled The Quiet Professional, portrayed him as a soldier who'd volunteered for the most dangerous assignments while maintaining the kind of professional discretion that made classified operations possible. Reading about his service, I finally understood why he'd been chosen to carry the encryption device, why his superiors had trusted him with technology that could compromise entire operations if it fell into enemy hands. He'd been more than brave, he'd been reliable in ways that made other people's courage possible. The book also explained why he'd kept the device after retirement. His unit had been disbanded quietly, their equipment scattered or destroyed, their service records sealed. In the chaos of demobilization, the encryption device had simply disappeared into his personal effects, another piece of military surplus that bureaucrats assumed had been properly disposed of. But Granddad Joe had understood its significance. Rather than turning it in to officials who might not appreciate its historical importance, he'd preserved it as a reminder of service that couldn't be publicly acknowledged. When he'd left it to me, he'd been trusting that I'd recognize its value and protect it appropriately. Danny read the book before I did, calling with excitement that reminded me of childhood discoveries. Did you know he volunteered for extra missions? That he stayed behind enemy lines longer than anyone else in his unit? That Chinese forces had a bounty on his head. No, he never talked about any of that. Because he was humble. Because he understood that real heroes don't need to tell hero stories. Danny's voice carried awe and pride. Maria's been reading passages to Jonathan. Not that he understands yet, but we want him to know what kind of man his great-grandfather was. The deployment to Germany ended with commendations and the promise of future senior assignments. I returned to Fort Bragg to find that my reputation had grown during my absence, that colleagues viewed me as someone capable of handling complex international responsibilities. The path toward colonel, and eventually general, was becoming clearer. But more importantly, I returned to find that my relationship with Danny had not only survived the separation, but had been strengthened by shared purpose. His interest in family history had evolved into genuine appreciation for military service. My deployment had demonstrated that our connection could withstand distance and competing priorities. Jonathan's first birthday party was held in the backyard. Danny and Maria had transformed into a child-safe wonderland. Watching my brother chase his toddling son around plastic playground equipment, I saw the completion of his transformation from careless young man to devoted father. The chaos that had once defined his life had been replaced by the different but purposeful chaos of parenthood. "You're good at this," I told him as we watched Jonathan destroy a birthday cake with the systematic enthusiasm that one-year-olds bring to all tasks. I had to learn how to be responsible for someone else. Turns out it's easier when that someone else is worth the effort. He gestured toward Maria, who was documenting Jonathan's cake destruction with the dedication of a war correspondent. Both of them, actually. Granddad would be proud of all of this. The family you've built, the man you've become. He'd be proud of you too. Lieutenant Colonel Collins, International Intelligence Coordinator, defender of classified devices. Danny grinned, but his expression grew serious. I know I never really apologized for selling the typewriter. For betraying your trust, for almost ruining your career, for being such a selfish idiot. You don't need to, yes, I do. What I did was inexcusable. I took something that mattered to you and traded it for beer money. I dismissed your feelings and betrayed your trust. If you hadn't been strong enough to tell the truth when it mattered, we'd both still be living with the consequences of my stupidity. The apology was more complete than I'd expected, more thoughtful than necessary. Danny had clearly been thinking about that moment for years, understanding its implications in ways that went beyond immediate consequences. It worked out the way it needed to, I said finally. We both learned things we needed to know. Still, I'm sorry. And I'm grateful. For not protecting me from the consequences, for forcing me to grow up, for trusting that I could become someone worth respecting. Jonathan chose that moment to launch himself from his high chair toward Danny, who caught him with the reflexes of someone accustomed to toddler unpredictability. Watching them together, Danny patient and attentive, Jonathan secure in his father's arms, I felt the satisfaction of witnessing transformation completed. That evening, after the guests had gone and Jonathan had fallen asleep surrounded by wrapping paper and new toys, Danny and I sat on the front porch drinking beer and watching suburban families conclude their weekend activities. Children were being called in for baths, lawn mowers were being returned to garages, porch lights were beginning to flicker on as darkness approached. "Do you think he'll want to serve?" Danny asked, gesturing toward the house where his son slept. "Militarily, I mean. That'll be his choice to make. But if he does, he'll come from a family that understands what service means." "That's not nothing. Speaking of which, Maria and I have been talking about something. We want to name you as Jonathan's guardian. In our wills, I mean. In case something happens to both of us." The request surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because it represented complete trust in my judgment and character. Danny was asking me to potentially raise his child, to make decisions that would shape a life he valued more than his own. That's a big responsibility. It's also a big honor. You're the person I trust most to raise him right if we can't. Danny finished his beer and set the bottle on the porch railing. You know how to balance love and discipline, how to prepare someone for the real world without breaking their spirit. You've been practicing on me for years. I thought about the 18-year-old who'd left home determined to serve something larger than herself, about the mistakes and growth that had brought me to this moment of being trusted with the most precious thing in my brother's life. The journey from enabler to truth-teller to trusted guardian felt complete in ways I hadn't expected. "I'd be honored," I said, meaning it completely. The conversation turned to lighter topics, Jonathan's developmental milestones, Maria's career plans, my next assignment possibilities. But underneath the casual chat was recognition that we'd built something solid from the wreckage of our original relationship, that the family we'd created through honesty and accountability was stronger than what we'd inherited through blood and circumstance. Later that night, alone in my hotel room near the base, I thought about Grandad Joe's encryption device, about its journey from classified operations in Korea to family heirloom to catalyst for transformation. Its physical presence was gone, secured in Pentagon storage where it belonged, but its real purpose had been fulfilled in ways that went beyond national security. It had taught us that some things are worth protecting, that truth matters more than comfort, that family loyalty means wanting each other to grow rather than just be safe. It had forced conversations we'd avoided, consequences we'd needed, growth we'd resisted. Most importantly, it had proven that relationships built on honesty could survive testing that destroyed those built on sentiment and obligation. The typewriter was gone, but its legacy lived in the choices we continued to make, the values we'd learned to uphold, the trust we'd earned through consistent action rather than inherited through shared history. Danny had become someone worthy of raising a child, and I'd become someone he trusted to help with that responsibility if needed. In the morning, I'd return to Fort Bragg and begin preparing for whatever challenges my career would bring next. But tonight, I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd traveled a difficult path and arrived somewhere worth the journey. Who'd learned that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone you love is the courage to tell them the truth and the strength to let them handle the consequences. Family can wound, but it can also heal. The bonds that survive honest testing become unbreakable. That's how one text from my brother turned into a call from the Pentagon, and a lesson I'll never forget. What about you? Have you ever had someone dismiss something you valued, only for it to turn out priceless? Or trusted family with responsibility, only to regret it later? Share your story in the comments. I read every one. And if you found this worth your time, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true stories about boundaries, loyalty, and what happens when the truth finally comes out.